done is start to shift away from any kind of indirect representation within the drawings and shift more towards something that is dealing very particular with all of the conditions of the presentation of the frame and the drawing in and of itself. So dealing with incidents and subtle shifts of light and color, of shadows, and playing this sort of game between the drawing and the frame now.
And fake and real shadows, so, or maybe fake's not the best word, but a kind of projected shadow as a drawing, and then the actual shadows from the light sources in the space. And I mean, I think one of the things was with the previous drawings that everyone seemed to want to focus on Lincoln, like the figure of Lincoln, and it being about that, and that's when people got it. And so I think we wanted to move away from having to rely on something pictorial in that sense, and so just go like as abstract as we possibly can. And the other side of that is I think it also kind of demands a longer attention of viewing it so that all the subtleties would become kind of apparent, as opposed to here's an immediate image that you would get and that's it. Trying to tease out like the really subtle hues that are operating within those kind of gradiated shadow zones, and also when you get multiple shadows from different light sources, you get kind of darker spots and the slightly lighter spots, things like that, and how color, the slight shades of color work within those areas, like near the darker versus the lighter. And so I think this is trying to like amplify that to a certain point where if you pay attention, you can start to, I think, notice the play between the kind of artificial and the real in that sense.
The project is called Eye Candy and is a set of 4 tables and benches. The topic of the benches is candies, and there are big graphic applied to the tables themselves. In the office we're working very much on images and how images go from figural to abstract, and so in these tables we're taking 3-dimensional scans of candies and through pictorial techniques and scripting techniques going from the figural to the abstract. And the 4 tables are examples of that, and in a way want to be a playful experience for the visitors coming to the show and being able to touch and see the materialization of the images onto furniture. Rather than understanding paintings as being on the wall, we actually understand them as being part of the environment, and so the idea that tables would be a good playing ground for that experience. I think museums have a temporary nature, meaning that if architecture is part of an exhibition, usually there is a temporary nature. It's always an exhibition that has an amount of time. Therefore, that temporary nature changes the way we understand architecture being exhibited into museums. I think this exhibition takes on a specific trajectory of digital design and how that allowed for multidisciplinary approach to the field. So that's what I think it does.
You need to stop. I need you to stop, Dustina. Quiet. I'm going to take you home. Okay, so there's not a name for the project yet, but I think that will develop. But we've really begun with a set of assumptions. You know what? I got to get rid of this now. She's got to go away. Come here. Here, kitty, sit down. We've been, for the past few years, working with paper that's sprayed onto these armatures that we make, and then we place lights within them, and so they almost kind of could be understood as a lamp. Well, they didn't even actually begin as lamps. They began as just an an intuition about how to use this material, you can get different effects. You can make it very thick, or you can make it very thin. So in our case, we have to make it thin enough so that it allows light to be transmitted through it. How can I take my interests in materials, in space, in geometry, etc., and apply them to a gallery? I've always had those kinds of interests. I've never been really comfortable with the boundaries. And so we develop a way of making something, and then the project becomes the result of an exploration of how far you can take that process. We oftentimes don't know what the form is going to be as we imagine a way of making things, a way of manipulating material. They suggest lamps, but they're installed, or they relate to the space in a way that's decidedly not the way that a lamp relates to the space. I think it gives you the sort of permission to think about it that way. You have the freedom to display objects that could be understood as being products in a way that is decidedly not product-like.
Actually, you should start.
I think that's a nice. You do that a lot.
Do I?
Just kidding.
We started out thinking about, in very sort of simple terms, like lightness and heaviness, and kind of mess with them, distort the perception in some way, just challenge your normal expectations of what's light and what's heavy. Hopefully there's like a lightness to our work that is kind of important to us conceptually, just in general, and the architecture work and everything that we do. We like the idea of not taking ourselves too seriously, of kind of having fun with what we do.
In our work in general, we kind of like to mix things together in a way, or in like odd situations or odd like combinations of things. And we also, your relationship to space, like that's actually something that we are interested in. So, when approaching a project like this, we can do something that's sort of exploring some of the bigger ideas that don't always manifest themselves in very real ways in like real built projects. And since we're a firm that does a lot of like built work, this is like a fun way to test out like maybe the extremes of that. And that's where like the lightness and heaviness and sort of toying kind of comes in.
And so we've morphed that idea kind of over time into something else, which is kind of a shower of clouds.
Shower of smaller
that
clouds.
have rained down.
Still concrete clouds. So they're still like the thing that's typically very light is now heavy and dense and massive and is on the ground. And then the concrete, which perhaps made the clouds on the ground, the bags of them are now floating overhead. So now the heavy thing is overhead and dangling above you, but in a light, sort of airy manner. I mean, we use concrete all the time, but we don't typically cast it ourselves. So that's a fun like challenge.
And we don't make it into shapes
or make
that
it
are
into shapes from like.
That's new, totally new
kinda
for
new.
us. Like we're taking bags and sewing them, and our team that we're working with, they are very much a part of that because
I don't think
have
either
more
of us
sewing
would consider
experience.
ourselves great seamstresses.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
just our natural tendency, given who we are, is to stretch what we call architecture, what people think of architecture as.
About 10 years ago, I had this idea about building a real-time design tool that would make it possible for people to be able to experience 3D designs before they're actually built. You can take their 3D models that you're designing, and then you can take them out of the softwares that you're already using and then put them into our system, and then you'll build a 3D model that you can actually walk through, and you can do that through an immersive headset that you wear over your eyes. And so what I'm going to do for my exhibit is actually build a version of that I haven't finalized what the content's going to be yet, but we're going to make it possible for someone to be able to put on a head-mounted display and then just transport themselves to some other amazing place. And that could either be like a real-world place like Villa Savoie or some other place like that, or some sort of fantasy place like a painting, what's your favorite painting or something like that. Like I said, I had this idea for this thing 10 years ago, but you couldn't do it because the hardware was so expensive. And so the headsets used to be between $40,000 and $100,000, and now they're $300. So the price points come down so much that now you can have a consumer version of the software. VR has a bad rap. You know, people are like, oh, it's some 80s weird thing, and it's not like that anymore. It's come so far. It can be super realistic. I would say more than anything, I'm a user experience designer, more than an architect. I've always been interested in designing things that can be personalized and customized to users. And so when I first started my career, it was all about how that manifests itself in spaces. I mean, for me, everything is about the user experience, and the user experience is the end goal, and the hardware and the software and all that other stuff is just a part of getting to that end goal. I want to show people that it's possible to use it and actually go somewhere and have the feeling that you're actually there. I'm very much learn on my own, teach myself how to do stuff. Again, it's just about the end goal. And if I can't do something, which happens a lot because we work on really complicated projects, then what I want to do is work with the best people, and we create a really cool team and we do it together, which is what we're doing on this project.
I may be different than the others, I think, in that I don't seek to, my end goal actually is not to exhibit, believe it or not. It's fun too, and I enjoy it, but it's kind of a deadline for me in a ways and a means to get research completed. You asked the question earlier, how tall can we make this tower? And it's going to be relative to the strength of the materials. And if it were up to me, I would sit there and trying to make it as tall as we can in order to test the extremes of what we can do, especially because it's an art setting as opposed to somebody living in this thing, right, in a temporary situation. But at the same time, we're limited by the height of the ceilings or the size of the space. Right. And putting it outside is an enormous problem because of permitting and that kind of stuff, I know. So that's what I kind of wanted to discuss, is how to display it. Do we make it bigger, display it in pieces, or do we make it to fit and make it 16 or 17 feet tall so that we can perfectly fit it in the gallons? When I started working with the thermal bimetal, the obvious use for it was the fact that it could respond to temperature, and the fact that our outdoor temperature changes all the time was probably the immediate thing that came to mind. The thermal bimetal is a lamination of two different metals together, and each metal has a different coefficient of expansion. And so what happens is the metal, one side will expand more than the other when heated, and so the result is a curl. A lot of my work previous to this was very kinetic and dynamic in nature, but it was mechanical. I was trying to come up with using the energy from the human body or some, again, low energy source, a renewable energy source, I guess, and still get movement out of it. So when I was looking at a lot of materials, I thought, well, why can't we just use all these materials in architecture? Because there's a lot of smart materials out there. And so I became really interested in this material, hunted it down far and wide, and was, I think, pretty determined. It's used mostly as an industrial material. So it's the coil in a thermostat. Anywhere from a residential thermostat to an automobile to high-powered machinery, but it's never used as a surface material. So that's very, very different. So no one has done that before. For me, it's less interesting when I just show something I've done before. To me, it's always an opportunity to do something new. At first, when I started applying for grants, one of the things they always ask for is how are you going to disseminate your work, right? And I thought, who really cares? It's just research, right? But then I realized how important it is to really get it out there, not to just show people what I do, but to inspire others to do more too, or do similar, or do, take things further. And it's a way of establishing a certain kind of, strangely, I guess, legacy to do that. So it's very fulfilling because I'm an educator. That is just a different way of kind of educating.
So what would you say architecture is? Like, how would you explain it to someone who doesn't have any notion of what it is, like for you?
What is it?
So yeah, I think everything is architecture. I mean, everything in the world is architecture. I think design is architecture. I mean, at some level, everything is. Writing is, I mean, building software is, everything is.
Provides a service to society in terms of construction of buildings, but I think architecture is somehow a wider, has a wider aim. And that's not only to provide a service, but also to define what culture is. I think as a cultural practice is influenced by different disciplines and needs aesthetic trends, as many other design fields are.
It's really putting me on the spot.
Probably easier for him because Matt's trained. He has an art background. I'm not.
Okay.
So I consider myself a dabbler in that arena, and I've actually learned a lot from him in terms of the kind of histories of that.
Embedded with ideas that go beyond mere building and mere function.
At one end of the spectrum, I would say I'm an architect, but to me, the spectrum is so much broader than just physical space.
When you look around and see all the other technology, the electronics, etc., that we have, and the capabilities, or even automobile technology, airplanes, all that kind of stuff, you realize how far behind we are with architecture, technologically. And whether it's a cultural issue of familiarity, that we demand our houses to look like something that was, built 100 years ago, versus something that's very technologically advanced.
The architectural installation was the kind of venue for young designers and architects to explore fabrication methods, new forms, all the new technologies that are kind of at our disposal. And I think here we kind of shied away from that a bit, actually. And so it was probably more uncomfortable for me, just because you're now engaging in another discipline, in a sense, on their own terms.
It's very, very different. I mean, I think
It's
of it as
very
very
different.
different. And I think I personally anyway, have a hesitation where like I don't want to say I'm an artist in any way. I feel
No,
like
no,
I'm an
no.
architect,
We're
I'm a
architects
designer,
who-
and the art part. But
We are
love
artistic.
to make
We are artistic.
we love to make things.
But we are not artists.
We think of architecture from the spoon to the city, so we're thinking of architecture going from small industrial design to much larger operations and buildings, and we like to embrace architecture at different scales. So I don't think architecture is just the production of a building. I think architecture is a production of an idea, a representation of a building in general, much more than a building itself.
That you can make things that are in dialogue with architecture, that imply things about architecture, that suggest things about architecture, that have architectural ideas embedded in them, but they're not architecture themselves. I think that I like a simple definition of architecture, like a simple understanding of it as being, space, buildings, and so forth. And so most of the things that we're doing right now are not that.
And once we're not designing a building, are we no longer doing architecture? Are we doing something else?
The scale of the projects that we're working on, the scale of the things that would fit into a museum that have maybe all of the images or the size or proportions of, say, something that would be sculpture, I would say that those things all are still part of a larger architectural investigation rather than an art investigation.
He always follows the Vitruvian virtues, which probably separate us more directly from artists and from engineers, which is the commodity, utility, and delight, right? And so that we have to combine aesthetics with things that work and also have some kind of function to them.
Like it's more sort of self-driven architecture. You have clients and you're it's creative and there is some artistry to it, but you're producing kind of a product that there is an exchange. You're doing work for fee, which is different from when you're like this project. We have more freedom, so I think we would love to have more of that freedom in the architecture work that we do.
I feel like the exhibition is more of a commentary on of the curator on the fact that design fields are overlapping each other. It feels to me that the way in which they organize the exhibition, the people they chose, is to prove or to somehow show that design is now a much wider field than it was once upon a time, where expertise of production really limited the way of working.
I think the beauty of architecture is it's very social, sociological. Like it affects a broad group of people, or like people in ways that maybe they don't even notice, even bad architecture or non-architecture or the built environment. To me, that's the interesting thing about architecture is like all parts of the urban fabric are affecting people's daily lives without them even knowing it.
More than anything, I hope that the show is just going to get people, just the general public, to come in and be like, oh, people think of architecture maybe not in the most classic way or the way that I think of architecture, and they're doing really cool stuff. They're doing cool stuff with patterning or with software or with whatever, and architecture is a lot more than just making buildings.
Architecture is another way of understanding it. It's supposed to be that it's a discourse, it's a discussion, and work is really can really contribute to that discussion from a gallery when it's presented in a gallery context, especially when there's multiple things that are placed side by side. They're all sort of in discussion with each other. And if you frame the discussion as being one about architecture, then it's about architecture.
I think when we think of this exhibit, what we want to do is create something that people can experience outside of the museum after they come. Like, what kind of takeaways can we give them? What can we have them thinking about as they're leaving the exhibit and thinking about for the next weeks? Like, oh my God, all I had to do was put on a headset to go somewhere else and experience a whole new thing. And, it kind of opens your mind up to new possibilities that you never would have expected, which I think is cool.